There are moments when a single sentence slices through the noise of our world and makes you whisper to yourself, "This feels uncomfortably real." That feeling is why we need to talk about 1984. George Orwell published this novel in 1949 after years of witnessing political manipulation, propaganda, and the terrifying abuse of power on a global scale. Orwell was not just any writer. He was a journalist with a fierce commitment to truth, an essayist whose clarity could cut through fog, a thinker who wrote Homage to Catalonia, an Animal Farm, and a man whose political insight came from lived experience rather than armchair theory. 1984 did not win the kind of glittering awards that modern books collect, but it accomplished something rarer. It became a permanent part of our cultural vocabulary. The word Orwellian has become a warning sign in almost every public debate, and the novel continues to appear on lists of the most important books of the 20th century. There is a line from the book that always stops me in my tracks. It is the simple, dread-filled truth that says, if you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. It is the kind of sentence that echoes in your mind long after the last page is turned. If you enjoy deep dives into literature and love following stories beneath the surface, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the Echoes of Books channel, or supporting the project through a small donation. Your engagement helps keep these long-form essays alive. Let us settle in for a moment and step gently into the gray and restless world of 1984. I want to tell the story the way you might hear it from a friend over a late-night cup of coffee, the kind where the steam curls slowly upward while the truth sinks slowly in. The novel opens on a sharp April day in London, but not the London we know. This one belongs to the superstate of Oceania. The air tastes of soot and boiled cabbage, and the city seems to sag under the weight of endlessly watching eyes. Posters of Big Brother stare from every corner, his gaze so steady and calm that it feels less like surveillance and more like a quiet erasure of your ability to hide. Right from the beginning, Orwell does not shout his warning. He whispers it, letting the uneasiness build in our bodies long before it reaches our minds. Winston Smith arrives in this world with the tired softness of someone who has been carrying invisible wounds for years. He's not particularly heroic. He's small, thin, pale, and inside him something has been worn down by decades of fear and monotony. Yet there is one spark he refuses to let go of. He still remembers fragments of a different time, even though the party wants all memories to be blurry, bendable, and obedient. Winston works at the Ministry of Truth. His job is to rewrite history so that the party is always right. If the party predicts higher chocolate rations and they actually lower them, Winston quietly goes into the archives, changes old newspapers, and makes it look like everything went exactly as Big Brother said. It is a world where objective truth has been flattened into clay. There is a heartbreaking rumor in the novel about Winston's childhood. Something about his mother and sister disappearing in the chaos of past wars. He cannot quite grasp it, but it haunts him like a dream whose details run away the moment you open your eyes. It is one of the few private sorrows he has left, and the party wants even that to fade. One day, Winston commits the first rebellion available to him. He buys a small, blank diary from a dusty antique shop owned by an old man named Meister, Charrington. The shop smells of lost times and forgotten objects, and Mr. Charrington speaks with a gentle warmth that feels out of place in this harsh world. Many readers have speculated about Charrington over the years. Was he once a real romantic of old London? Did he truly enjoy sharing old rhymes like oranges and lemons say the bells of St. Clement's, or was it all an act from the start? Whether innocent or staged, this moment gives Winston the faintest breath of something authentic. Back in his apartment, Winston opens the diary and writes the forbidden words, "Down with Big Brother." It is not a shout. It is a tremble. But in a society built on fear, a tremble is enough to qualify as rebellion. Then comes Julia, a young woman with dark hair, quick movements and eyes that hold both danger and mischief. At first, Winston mistrusts her. She wears the red sash of the Junior Anti-Sex League, a group committed to strict chastity for the sake of the party. Rumors around her are messy. Some think she is a zealot. Others whisper that she might be spying for the thought police. But when she slips Winston a secret note saying, "I love you," everything shatters. The world that seems so predictable bursts open into something bright and terrifying. Suddenly, Winston is alive again. Their meeting in the countryside feels like the novel takes a deep breath. Grass, sunlight, the scent of crushed bluebells under their feet. The party cannot fully sterilize nature, and Orwell uses it as the one place where Winston and Julia can experience something like freedom. Julia is bold. She brings stolen chocolate wrapped in real paper. She laughs easily and moves with the confidence of someone who has learned how to rebel in small, subtle ways. Some scholars speculate that Julia had many secret lovers before Winston, and that this practice was her quiet resistance to the party's attempt to control desire. Julia's rebellion is rooted in the body, while Winston's is rooted in memory and thought. It is a beautiful tension. They teach each other different kinds of courage. They begin meeting in a rented room above Mr. Charrington's shop. This room is dusty, shabby, and lit with warm light. It becomes their sanctuary. There is a glass paperweight Winston buys there, a small object with coral inside. He imagines their lives floating safely within that tiny world. It is one of the novel's most gentle images, a pocket of time they almost believe they can protect. Then enters O'Brien. He's an inner party member with calm, intelligent eyes. To Winston, O'Brien feels like someone who understands, someone who sees through the party's lies. There are rumors about O'Brien, too. Some say he once spoke a forbidden phrase. Some say he is part of a resistance group known as the Brotherhood. Winston clings to these whispers because they offer hope that he is not entirely alone in his silent rebellion. O'Brien invites Winston and Julia to his apartment, where he speaks of revolution with the gravity of someone who has waited a long time to do so. He pours real wine, something almost mythic in their world. Winston feels seen. He feels chosen. He feels the kind of hope that makes a person brave enough to imagine a world beyond fear. But hope in 1984 has a short shelf life. One night, just as Winston and Julia are resting in their cozy little room, the truth bursts open like a cold wind. Behind the picture frame they had admired so many times, there is a hidden telescreen. The room has never been safe. Mr. Charrington is not a kind old shopkeeper. He is a member of the thought police. The lovers are arrested. The paperweight falls and shatters into tiny fragments. It is the end of their hidden freedom. Winston is taken to the Ministry of Love, which might be the most terrifyingly ironic building name in all literature. Its rooms are white and bright. The lights never turn off. Time dissolves. Winston is questioned, beaten, then brought to O'Brien, and here the world flips. O'Brien is not a rebel. He's the party's most loyal instrument. His voice remains gentle. His reasoning remains calm. But now his gentleness serves cruelty. This section of the book is filled with haunting lines. O'Brien says, "The object of power is power. Not liberty or justice or happiness, just power." It is hard to read without feeling the chill of recognition, because the idea is not imprisoned in fiction. After weeks or months or maybe years in this place, Winston is taken to room 101. It is the room where a person meets the thing they fear most. Winston's fear is rats. In a moment of pure terror, he betrays Julia. He screams to have the horror done to her instead. And with that one cry, the fragile core of his humanity splinters. When he is released, he is a ghost of himself. Thin, pale, empty. He drinks Victory gin in a cheerful monotone. He passes Julia on the street once. They exchange a few broken words. Whatever they once shared has evaporated. The novel closes with Winston sitting alone in the Chestnut Tree Cafe, watching the news on a telescreen, a faint smile forming on his lips. He understands that 2 and 2 make 5 if the party wills it. And then comes the final sentence. He loved Big Brother. It lands not like a blow, but like a quiet surrender. That is the story at its surface. A man who tries to stay human in a world that punishes humanity. A love story crushed by a machine. A warning wrapped in whispered truth. When I think about the structure of 1984, I always picture a trap that looks harmless at first. A quiet hallway. A slow closing door. A place where you walk in thinking you are just reading a story, and then, without warning, you realize the walls have been narrowing around you from the very beginning. Orwell was far too intelligent to rely on cheap shocks. Instead, he built the novel like a psychological labyrinth, a place where every turn reveals a new layer of pressure, and every layer teaches you something about what it means to be human under total control. The book is divided into 3 parts, but it is really divided into 3 emotional states. The first is a kind of suffocation. The world is gray, heavy, and oddly quiet. Winston wakes each day to the same metallic voice on the telescreen. He walks the same cracked pavements. This is not just world building. It is pacing as philosophy. Orwell wants you to feel what Winston feels. That slow tightening of the chest, the dull ache of routine, the strange numbness that comes from being watched and knowing you cannot react. The rhythm here is slow because Winston has almost forgotten how to live. In many ways, this is the most unsettling part of the book because nothing is dramatic. The terror comes from how normal everything seems, how totalitarianism rarely arrives with fire and trumpets. It arrives gently, asking only for tiny compromises. Smile at the right moment. Chant the right slogan. Swallow your questions, then swallow them again and again, until you cannot taste the difference anymore. But then, something miraculous happens. Julia appears and suddenly the rhythm changes. Readers often underestimate the brilliance of this shift. The chapters become quicker. The scenes feel brighter. Even the sentences loosen their tightness. It is as if the novel itself takes a breath along with Winston. Nature becomes available to us again. The text opens up, literally and emotionally. The oppressive hallways give way to fields, trees, birds. We are allowed to believe that the human heart still has a place in this world. This is not accidental. Orwell uses this structural expansion to lure us into hope. He knows that a story about despair must first give you something to desire, something fragile enough to break your heart once it is taken away. And then comes the third movement, which is not just a collapse, but a disorientation. Time stops behaving normally. Days blur. The structure of the narrative mirrors the structure of a destroyed mind. Winston no longer knows how long he has been in the ministry of love. Weeks might be minutes. Minutes might be years. Orwell takes linear storytelling and quietly tears it apart. The reader loses balance. And that is entirely the point. Totalitarianism does not simply torture the body. It dismantles the inner sense of time itself. Without time, the self cannot anchor. Without self, the world becomes whatever the party says it is. When Winston finally accepts 2 and 2 equals 5, the collapse is complete. Not because he believes it, but because he no longer has the inner continuity required to resist. There is a lesser-known discussion among scholars that Orwell originally wanted the structure to feel even more claustrophobic. Some early notes suggest he imagined scenes that would repeat with slight variations like a nightmare loop. This idea never became explicit in the text, but you can feel its shadow. Winston's life is repetitive by design. The morning exercise routine, the workday monotony, the hateful ritual of the 2 minutes hate. These loops keep him trapped long before the ministry of love ever touches him. By the time the torture begins, he has already been spiritually softened by years of structural repetition. What is remarkable is how Orwell keeps the reader emotionally aligned with Winston without letting the novel turn into a diary of despair. He does this with a very subtle trick. The narrative never fully merges with Winston's mind. It stays just a little bit above him, like a quiet observer sitting on the edge of the room. This distance creates tension. We feel Winston's fear, but we also recognize its tragic inevitability. We root for him, yet we sense from the first chapter that the structure of the world is stronger than he is. This tragic framing is one of the novel's most powerful features. It is what gives the story its slow, burning heartbreak. Another rarely discussed component of the novel's architecture is the way Orwell uses silence. There are pauses in the prose where nothing is said, but everything is implied. The silence when Winston opens his diary. The silence in the countryside when Julia looks at him with a mischievous smile. The silence in O'Brien's apartment before he speaks, and Winston feels recognized for the first time. These quiet moments create an emotional contour inside the otherwise relentless world of the party. They show us what is sacred in Winston's life. They show us what is worth losing. As a whole, the novel's structure becomes a kind of moral fable told in architectural form, a descent into fear, a rise into illicit hope, and a brutal leveling that flattens everything. It is almost musical. The first movement is a low hum, the second a brief, trembling melody, the third a violent return to the original note but stripped of softness. Orwell composes the novel like a symphony where humanity is the instrument, and the party is the conductor who believes only one sound should exist. What moves me most is that the structure gently prepares you for the emotional collapse without making it predictable. Even though you sense that things cannot end well, the middle section is warm enough that you instinctively reach for the possibility of escape. That small tug in the chest is crucial. It proves that the novel is not about predicting a specific future. It is about showing how hope behaves under pressure, how it stubbornly blooms, how it flickers even in darkness, and how, if the world is cruel enough, it can be extinguished so completely that the person left behind whispers, "Love to the very force that destroyed them." When we talk about the characters in 1984, it is tempting to treat them as ordinary fictional people placed inside an extraordinary situation. But the longer you sit with the book, the more you realize that Orwell builds his characters the way a philosopher builds an argument. Each one is not just a person. Each one is a hypothesis about what the human mind does under pressure. They are experiments in fear, memory, desire, and power. They are the emotional organs of the novel, and each one beats a different rhythm. Winston Smith is the first and most fragile experiment. He's not built like a hero. He does not carry muscles or charisma or the kind of sharp intelligence that changes worlds. Instead, he carries that small, stubborn spark inside him, the one that whispers things could be different and things used to be different. That spark is what makes him dangerous. Totalitarianism can crush strength and brilliance with ease, but doubt is harder. Doubt flickers even in the darkest places. Winston's entire character is shaped around that flicker. His body is weak, but his mind holds onto scraps of memory that the party cannot fully erase. There is a powerful moment during Hate Week when he watches a prole woman hanging laundry in the courtyard and realizes he is witnessing something pure. He thinks, if there is hope, it lies in the proles. That line has fueled decades of debate. Some readers see it as naive. Others see it as a profound understanding that ordinary people carry the heartbeat of a society, even when elites lose touch. There is an interesting rumor among some biographers that Orwell partly modeled Winston on himself, but in a more diminished form. Orwell, who was constantly wrestling with illness and loneliness during the writing of the book, supposedly joked in a letter that Winston was what he feared he might become if he let the world wear him down. Whether true or not, Winston carries a very human vulnerability. He wants truth, but he also wants comfort. He wants rebellion, but he also wants companionship. He is torn between his desire to think and his desire to survive. This conflict is what makes him feel painfully real. Then there is Julia. She is one of the most misunderstood characters in the novel. People often read her as merely rebellious or merely seductive or merely shallow. But Julia is none of these things in isolation. She is a master of navigating the system with quiet cunning. Unlike Winston, she does not try to overthrow the entire regime. She tries to carve out pockets of pleasure where the party has declared pleasure illegal. Her form of rebellion is instinctive, bodily, breath-driven. She tells Winston that the more rules the party creates, the sweeter it feels to break them. That line alone reveals her philosophy. She resists not with theory, but with life force. One detail about Julia that fascinates many readers is her history of secret relationships before Winston. Some critics argue this shows she is promiscuous. Others argue it shows she is a survivor. But there is a third interpretation I find more compelling. Julia is the embodiment of the idea that the body remembers what freedom feels like, even when the mind forgets. She loves the stolen chocolate. She loves the sun on her skin. She loves the reckless joy of lying in the grass with a man she should not be meeting. Julia teaches Winston something essential. She teaches him that rebellion begins not with ideology, but with desire. Desire is the first boundary the party wants to control, because desire creates bonds, and bonds create loyalty, and loyalty creates possibility. Julia is the most alive character in the book because she refuses to surrender the one thing she can still claim for herself, her own sensations. Meanwhile, we have O'Brien, who is something entirely different. O'Brien is not just a character. He is a philosophical trap. Winston's fascination with O'Brien is not based on logic. It is based on a deep instinct that O'Brien sees the world clearly. And in a tragic way, this instinct is correct. O'Brien sees the world clearly, but through the eyes of someone who believes in absolute power. His intelligence is frightening because he uses it without mercy. There is a moment during Winston's torture when O'Brien says, "We are not interested in the good of others. We are interested solely in power. Not wealth or luxury or long life, only power." It is one of the coldest confessions in literature. There is a lesser-known anecdote among Orwell scholars about O'Brien's origin. Some believe Orwell based him partly on real political figures he met during the Spanish Civil War. Men who spoke about ideals with absolute certainty, but used that certainty to justify cruelty. Others believe O'Brien was modeled after a type rather than a person. The type who loves systems more than people. The type who believes that suffering is necessary if it leads to purity. Whether based on a real figure or not, O'Brien stands as the novel's most unsettling force because he represents the philosophical endpoint of totalitarian logic. If the party wants power for its own sake, then empathy becomes a flaw, reason becomes a weapon, and truth becomes whatever the powerful decide it is. Then we have the quieter figures. Parsons, the sweaty, cheerful neighbor who is arrested because his own daughter denounces him. He is the embodiment of a citizen who loves the party too blindly to see its cruelty. Syme, the brilliant linguist who works on the Newspeak dictionary, disappears one day because his intelligence becomes inconvenient. And the prole woman, singing while she hangs laundry, becomes the novel's final hymn to life. She is described as strong and broad with a voice that rises above her poverty. Winston watches her and sees hope. She becomes an accidental symbol of the world as it might be if left to ordinary people who still feel emotions freely. Each of these characters adds a philosophical thread. Winston shows us the fragility of truth. Julia shows us the rebellion of the body. O'Brien shows us the intoxication of certainty. Parsons shows us the danger of unthinking loyalty. Syme shows us how intelligence can be sterilized. And the prole woman shows us that life continues quietly even when the world seems broken. Taken together, they form the emotional backbone of 1984. They remind us that totalitarianism is not a single monster. It is a system of pressures that shape different people in different ways. Some break, some comply, some rebel, some simply endure. And through these characters, Orwell demonstrates that the human soul is not one thing. It is a fragile mosaic of fear, love, memory, hunger, and longing. And every piece matters. If the characters of 1984 are experiments in humanity, then language is the laboratory where the party performs its most radical and terrifying work. And this is the part of the novel that settles into your bones long after the plot fades. Orwell understood something most writers only touch by accident. He understood that language is not just a tool we use to describe the world. Language is the tool that creates the world inside us. Change the words and you change the thought. Change the thought and you change the self. And once the self is compromised, everything else becomes very simple to control. It is no coincidence that Orwell himself worked as a journalist, someone who spent his life trying to cut through propaganda and fog. He watched governments distort language during war. He watched newspapers twist meaning to shape public mood. Even earlier in Burma, while serving as a colonial officer, he saw firsthand how power manipulates truth just by choosing which words get spoken and which do not. These experiences pour into every page of the novel. Inside the world of 1984, the Ministry of Truth is the philosophical heart of the regime. It is where Winston works, changing sentences, altering statistics, deleting names of people who have become inconvenient. If someone is executed for treason, the ministry simply rewrites articles to show that the person never existed. History becomes a palimpsest, a parchment scraped clean over and over until the past itself becomes an empty shell. And Winston understands the horror of this better than anyone, because he is the one holding the pen. There is a line from O'Brien that strikes with clinical precision. He tells Winston, "Reality is not external. Reality exists only in the mind, and no two minds are ever alike." Then he adds the part that twists the knife. Only the mind of the party is real. It is the logic of domination in its purest form. If the party controls the definition of reality, then truth becomes whatever those in power choose to speak. Facts are no longer facts. They are decisions. The most famous linguistic experiment in the novel is Newspeak, the official language of Oceania. Many readers treat Newspeak as a clever joke or a quirky, fictional invention. But in the novel, it is one of the most violent tools ever conceived. Newspeak is not about communication. It is about strangling thought. Its purpose is to shrink the range of possible ideas. Words like freedom, honor, justice, love, and even rebellion are slowly removed. Once the words disappear from the dictionary, the ideas themselves are supposed to vanish from the mind. As Syme, the enthusiastic linguist, proudly says, by the year 2050, not a single person alive will be able to understand a conversation like the one we are having now. Syme is delighted. Winston is horrified. And the reader feels the chill of knowing that language can be eroded, not with fire, but with quiet editing. A lesser discussed, but equally important linguistic weapon is doublethink. The practice of holding two contradictory beliefs at the same time and accepting both as true. It is a mental gymnastics routine that the party expects all citizens to master. If Big Brother says they have always been at war with Astasia, then even yesterday's headlines must be forgotten. Orwell uses doublethink to show how language can break logic into submission. When people are forced to say something untrue over and over, eventually the lie becomes easier to believe than the effort required to resist it. There is something important here that many analyses overlook. Doublethink is not merely forced deception. It is a survival strategy. In a world where speaking your real thoughts can get you erased, doublethink becomes a form of mental camouflage. People learn to hide from themselves. They silence their own doubts. They reshape their own memories just to stay afloat. Orwell, is not only criticizing authoritarian regimes. He's showing how human beings learn to contort their minds just to endure the pressure of living in a world that punishes honesty. One of the most heartbreaking moments in the novel occurs when Winston finds an old photograph that proves the party lied about the supposed traitors Jones, Mundaway, Cecia, Aronson, and Rutherford. He holds this piece of paper in his hands and feels something deep and desperate. He thinks, "This was real. I saw it. It happened." But soon the pressure of the party's rewritten history makes even Winston doubt his own eyes. The photograph eventually disappears, and with it, Winston feels his memory pulling away like a tide. Without language to frame the truth becomes slippery, impossible to grasp, like trying to catch smoke with bare fingers. Orwell wrote a famous essay years before the novel titled Politics and the English Language. In it, he argued that political language is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable. That essay is a theoretical map. 1984 is the living landscape built from it. You can read the entire novel as a dramatization of what happens when political manipulation is allowed to swallow the whole vocabulary of a nation. There is a small detail about newspeak that I have always loved. It is almost comic in a tragic way. The party wants to eliminate irregular verbs because irregularity implies uniqueness, and uniqueness implies individuality. The language becomes flattened, smoothed, uniform. In a world where even grammar becomes a political battleground, you see how deeply Orwell understood the connection between language and soul. If a society speaks in broken or limited words, its emotional range shrinks. Its moral imagination shrinks. Its ability to resist shrinks. Some scholars today argue that the novel predicted not just authoritarian language, but also our modern era of marketing and political spin. Watch how governments use phrases like enhanced interrogation instead of torture, or how companies use words like data enhancement instead of surveillance. And you begin to see how Orwell's linguistic warnings extend far beyond the borders of any one political system. The danger is universal. Whenever language becomes soft, slippery, or deliberately vague, someone is often trying to hide a bruise. But Orwell does not leave us in darkness. There are quiet linguistic moments of beauty. Winston's memory of his mother, Julia whispering her secret, "I love you." The prole woman singing a song that has no political purpose. These moments remind us that language can hold tenderness too. It can hold truth and longing and rebellion. Even in Oceania, language remains a tool of hope. A small, fragile tool, but still capable of carving out meaning. In the end, Winston's defeat is marked by a linguistic surrender. Not only does he accept the party's words, he accepts the party's grammar of reality. He no longer says 2 + 2 = 4. He no longer clings to forbidden phrases. The collapse of his language marks the collapse of his mind. And when he whispers that he loves Big Brother, it is not only a political submission, but a linguistic submission. The final and most devastating proof that if you control the words, you control the world. When you peel back the layers of 1984, something remarkable happens. The novel stops feeling like pure imagination and starts feeling like a room with the windows left open. Cold winds from the real world drift in. You can sense the weight of wars, the bitterness of political betrayal, and the exhaustion of entire nations trying to rebuild themselves. Orwell did not write this book from a distant tower. He wrote it with hands that had touched the edges of violence and eyes that had watched truth unravel at close range. To understand the story fully, you have to understand the shadows behind it. George Orwell was born Eric Arthur Blair, and his life often reads like a series of collisions with power. As a young man, he served in Burma under the British Empire, a system he came to despise. He once wrote that seeing imperialism up close filled him with an intolerable sense of guilt. He witnessed how an empire controls not only land, but also the narrative of moral righteousness. This experience planted one of the earliest seeds of 1984. He saw how power speaks in polished sentences, while real suffering happens in silence. Later in Spain, Orwell fought in the Spanish Civil War on the side of the anti-fascists. What he found there shocked him even more than the battlefield. He saw factions within the same side turning on each other. He watched comrades disappear from records, their names scrubbed from official documents, not because they were wrong, but because they were politically inconvenient. He watched newspapers contradict themselves from one day to the next without shame. And perhaps most hauntingly, he saw how quickly people accepted these contradictions if the alternative meant questioning the group. That experience created one of the most iconic lines in the novel, the line that says, "The past was erased, the erasure was forgotten, the lie became truth." He did not invent that idea. He witnessed it. Then came World War II and the propaganda machines that accompanied it. Orwell worked for the BBC during the war, producing broadcasts for India and Southeast Asia. He was expected to present British actions in the most flattering light possible. He later admitted that the job made him feel like he was writing lies for half a living. The constant flood of slogans and morale-boosting messages left him skeptical of any system that uses language as a disinfectant. When he describes the 2 minutes hate in the novel, with its frenzy of shouting and emotional manipulation, he is reflecting what he saw in wartime rallies and state-controlled media across Europe. The hatred is staged, but the emotion becomes real. The Britain of the late 1940s also permeates the novel. Rationing was still in effect. Bombed-out buildings still lined the streets. People queued for everything. There was a kind of gray austerity in everyday life that felt like the emotional backdrop of a country trying to recover while still being watched over by a vast bureaucratic state. Some readers think Orwell exaggerated the bleakness. Those who lived through that period often say he understated it. The Victory gin, the poor quality cigarettes, the crumbling stairwells, and the fatigue of people who seem older than their years all reflect the atmosphere of post-war London. Orwell wrote the novel while battling severe tuberculosis on the remote island of Jura in Scotland. The environment there was harsh and isolated. Cold wind, long nights, a sense of being cut off from the world. Biographers often say that Orwell poured his physical pain into Winston's emotional suffering. You can feel it in the descriptions of his aching varicose ulcer, his chronic fatigue, and the heaviness of his movements. In some ways, Winston is Orwell with his guard lowered, a man whose body has endured more than it should. The cultural influences on the novel extend even further. Orwell admired writers like Swift and Dickens, authors who use fiction as a weapon against injustice. From Swift, he inherited satire sharpened to a blade. From Dickens, he inherited compassion for the ordinary and downtrodden. But the most direct literary ancestor of 1984 is Yevgeny Zamyatin's novel, We, published in 1921. Orwell openly acknowledged its influence. Zamyatin's vision of a sterile and mathematically controlled society planted a seed that Orwell would later transform with more political precision. While We imagines rebellion in terms of individual awakening, Orwell imagines rebellion in terms of historical memory. The two books speak to each other across decades like distant cousins who understand each other's grief. 1984 also carries echoes of Huxley's Brave New World. Huxley once wrote to Orwell saying he believed the future might resemble his own drug-filled, pleasure-controlled dystopia more than Orwell's brutal one. And perhaps they were both right. Huxley describes a world pacified by pleasure. Orwell describes a world compelled by fear. Between them, they form a spectrum of how societies can lose themselves. Modern readers often debate which vision is closer to reality. Some argue that we are drifting into Huxley's world with distraction and overstimulation. Others argue that authoritarian impulses across the globe prove Orwell was the one who saw further. The truth probably lives somewhere uncomfortably in between. Another historical echo comes from Orwell's deep suspicion of political certainty. He saw how people on both the left and the right claimed to know the absolute truth and used that certainty to justify cruelty. O'Brien embodies this danger. He represents the intellectual who believes in the purity of his own ideology more than he believes in human beings. There is a moment when O'Brien calmly explains why the party seeks power for its own sake, not to improve society. It has the chilling tone of someone who once believed in ideals and replaced them with a devotion to machinery. Many scholars believe O'Brien reflects Orwell's fear that revolutions often become mirror images of the tyrannies they overthrow. Culturally, the novel was shaped by a century that had already witnessed the mechanization of human life. Industrialization, bureaucratic states, mass surveillance, scientific management, psychological warfare, and the rise of modern advertising all contributed to Orwell's realization that the human mind could be shaped like clay if the pressure was constant and precise enough. The novel absorbs that cultural anxiety and transforms it into fiction. There is even a quieter influence that deserves attention. During the 1940s, Orwell and many intellectuals watched the rapid growth of broadcast radio and early computing technologies. These were powerful tools that promised connection, but also raised fears about centralized control over information. The telescreen in the novel is a direct descendant of those fears. It is always on. It speaks and listens. It blurs the line between entertainment and domination. Orwell saw that once technology enters the home, power no longer knocks on the door. It simply watches from the wall. Understanding all these influences helps explain why 1984 does not read like a distant sci-fi fantasy. It reads like a convergence of lived realities, political trauma, and cultural anxieties. That is why the book still resonates 70 years later. Because its origins are not in imagination alone. They are in the history we inherited and the history we continue to make. Every powerful novel hides a secret map beneath its surface, a set of images and symbols that guide the emotional journey long before the reader consciously notices. In 1984, these symbols become a quiet counterpoint to the harsh world of the party. They are small, fragile objects and recurring images that carry meaning, like lanterns in a storm. Orwell does not over-explain them. He lets them glow softly in the background, and if you pay attention, each one tells a story of its own. The first and most delicate symbol is the glass paperweight. Winston finds it in Mr. Charrington's antique shop, a relic from a world before the party's sterilizing grip. Inside that paperweight is a small piece of coral suspended in clear glass, a tiny world frozen in time. Winston buys it impulsively, almost shyly. He does not need it. He does not even know why he wants it. Yet the moment he sees it, his entire posture softens. The paperweight is the physical form of his longing for a past that feels half imaginary yet emotionally real. That small sphere becomes the symbol of a life protected from fear. It is his dream of memory made beautiful. There is an almost tender moment when Winston imagines the paperweight as the room he shares with Julia. A sealed and gentle universe. A world within a world. That image is so delicate it almost feels forbidden. And when the thought police finally break in and arrest them, the paperweight shatters on the floor. The coral inside breaks free like a wounded creature. Orwell could not have chosen a clearer symbol for the destruction of Winston's inner life. When the glass breaks, something inside the reader breaks too. That shattering is not just the end of a moment of hope. It is the destruction of Winston's belief that any memory or desire can be protected from the party's reach. Another symbol that pulses through the novel is rats. Rats represent Winston's deepest and most primal fear. Something older than the party and older than ideology. Scholars sometimes note that Orwell himself was frightened of rats, but there is something more literary at work here. In many cultures, rats symbolize disease, contamination, and the collapse of boundaries between the safe and the unsafe. In Winston's case, the rats symbolize something even darker, the vulnerability we hide from others and sometimes even from ourselves. By using Winston's private fear as a weapon, the party makes the point that there is no interior life they cannot penetrate. Room 101 is not just torture, it is a spiritual invasion. The party forces Winston to betray someone he loves in order to protect the one part of his soul he cannot control. The symbolism here is brutal, but that is precisely why it works. It is the moment when Winston's inner self collapses under pressure, and Orwell uses the image of the rat to show how private terror becomes a political tool. Then there is the singing prole woman. She appears in the courtyard, hanging laundry, belting out a simple tune with surprising strength. She is not glamorous. She's not heroic in the classical sense. Yet she becomes the symbol of the world Orwell still believes in. A world where people laugh loudly, sing freely, raise children, hang clothes, and live with the natural messiness of ordinary human life. The party wants a universe of uniformity and obedience. The prole woman represents everything that cannot be easily standardized. She becomes a symbol of resilience, a quiet force of nature that refuses to break. Her presence suggests that even in the bleakest system, life finds places to bloom. There is a lesser-known but incredibly important symbol in the novel, the nursery rhyme. Winston hears the rhyme, "Oranges and lemons say the bells of St. Clement's," from Mr. Charrington, who recites it with a nostalgic smile. The rhyme represents cultural memory, the part of the human world that stretches back through generations without a political agenda. It is the one thing the party tries to erase because the past carries stories they cannot fully control. The rhyme appears throughout the novel like an echo of something older and wiser than the party's slogans. When Winston tries to recall the rest of the lines, it becomes a kind of quest for truth, the longing for a past that still feels alive even when the world denies it. This symbol becomes even more tragic when we learn that Charrington is a thought police agent. Even the past that comforts Winston is being weaponized against him. A quieter but essential symbol is the telescreen. It is not just a surveillance device. It is a symbolic stand-in for every force in society that intrudes on private life. It watches. It speaks. It commands. It never turns off. It is a symbol of the collapse of the boundary between public and private. When Winston tries to find a corner of the room where he cannot be seen, it feels like a spiritual instinct. Human beings need darkness. They need privacy. They need silence. The telescreen symbolizes the destruction of that instinct. And the fact that it sits casually on the wall like a household device makes it even more chilling. Even Victory Gin becomes a symbol in its own right. It numbs Winston's mind, warms his throat, and dulls his anxieties. The party uses it the way oppressive societies often use alcohol, as a tool of forgetfulness. A government need not silence dissent if it can make people too numb to care. The gin is the liquid form of despair disguised as comfort. Nature itself is a symbol throughout the story. When Winston and Julia meet in the countryside, the trees, the sunlight, and the open air symbolize a world untouched by the party's machinery. Birds appear several times, always singing freely. They become a soft reminder that there are forms of life the party cannot entirely dominate. For a moment, the reader feels the possibility of liberation. And then there is the Chestnut Tree Cafe, the place where broken people go to drink and forget. The repeated song lyric, "Under the spreading chestnut tree, I sold you and you sold me," becomes the final symbol of betrayal and resignation. It is the quiet grave where Winston's last fragments of self dissolve. All these symbols create the emotional undercurrent of the novel. Orwell does not need long poetic passages or elaborate metaphors. He uses simple objects and ordinary images, but each one carries the weight of a whole philosophy. Together, they form a secret blueprint for the story, a kind of emotional geography that guides the reader through Winston's decline. The symbols remind us that the most important battles in the novel are not fought with weapons. They are fought in the quiet corners of the mind, in the fragile places where memory, fear, and longing live together. One of the most beautiful and complicated things about 1984 is the way it refuses to stay still. The book has lived so many different lives that when you talk about its meaning, you are not just talking about Orwell's novel anymore. You are talking about how entire generations of readers have seen themselves reflected in its pages. The book becomes a mirror, and each era looks into it and sees a different kind of warning. When the novel first appeared in 1949, the world was raw. Europe was full of smokers coughing in bread lines, cities rebuilding their broken bones, families trying to make sense of a war that had rewritten the human imagination. Many early readers saw the book as a direct warning about Stalinist Russia. Newspapers described it as a political prophecy, a blueprint for what happens when ideology eats the individual. Some called it a masterpiece. Others said it was overly bleak. But nobody ignored it. A few critics even accused Orwell of being defeatist, of presenting a future so grim that it robbed people of hope. Yet even those critics admitted the novel had a kind of irresistible honesty, the honesty of someone who had seen too much to pretend. In the 1950s and 60s, the book became a Cold War artifact. Teachers used it as a tool to warn students about communism. Politicians quoted it as proof that free nations must stay vigilant. For many Western readers, 1984 became synonymous with totalitarianism itself. But this view, although common, was not universal. Some left-leaning readers felt uncomfortable watching Orwell's critique used as a political weapon. They argued that Orwell was not condemning socialism, but condemning the perversion of it. They pointed to Orwell's lifelong sympathy for working-class people and his support for democratic socialism. The debate grew so heated that it created an entire field of Orwell interpretation, the question of who Orwell really belonged to. By the 1970s, the novel took on a new life. People began to read it not only as a political warning, but as a psychological one. Scholars explored its themes of memory, trauma, and identity. They asked what happens to the human soul when language becomes corrupted and the truth becomes a moving target. Feminist scholars raised questions about the portrayal of Julia and the role of desire in the novel. Was Julia a symbol of sexual liberation or a victim of a male-centered narrative? Was Winston projecting his dreams onto her or genuinely discovering freedom? These readings opened up new dimensions of the text that were not part of mainstream discussions before. Then came the real 1984. Bookstores held special editions. Television networks hosted debates. Critics asked whether Orwell had predicted the future. Some people said yes, pointing to bureaucratic surveillance, government secrecy, and political doublespeak. Others said no, arguing that the world was nowhere near as controlled as the world of the novel. Yet beneath all these debates lay a single truth. The novel had become a cultural touchstone. Even people who had never read it knew what Big Brother meant. The late 20th century brought yet another shift. As mass surveillance technology grew and digital information spread across the world, readers began to feel an uncanny familiarity with Orwell's warnings. Terms like Orwellian and doublethink entered ordinary conversations. News headlines use them. Protesters use them. Social media use them. Even governments use them to accuse other governments of manipulation. Suddenly, the novel was everywhere. It no longer belonged to literature alone. It belonged to the cultural bloodstream. In the 21st century, the book's relevance only intensified. Social media platforms began to shape what people believed. Algorithms nudged public opinion. Disinformation campaigns flooded the internet. Cameras watched from street corners and laptop screens. And once again, 1984 rose back into the bestseller lists during moments of political tension. after major elections, after revelations of government surveillance, after debates about truth and misinformation, readers return to Orwell as if opening an old journal that had predicted their fears. Online communities added their own layers of interpretation. On Reddit, you will find readers who defend Winston passionately, arguing that he represents something noble. You will also find readers who criticize him as naive or even self-absorbed. On TikTok, younger readers often focus on the love story, on the raw tenderness Winston and Julia find in a world designed to destroy tenderness. On Twitter, the novel often becomes shorthand for political outrage, sometimes used thoughtfully and sometimes tossed like a grenade without much care for nuance. And in long-form literary forums, scholars continue to explore deeper meanings that earlier generations overlooked, including trauma theory, post-colonial interpretations, and ecological readings of the novel's wasteland-like atmosphere. One of the most interesting modern debates revolves around the ending. Many readers still argue over whether Winston's final acceptance of Big Brother is total or only external. Some believe Orwell intended the ending to shatter us. Others argue that the very bleakness of the final lines is meant to provoke rebellion in the reader. The idea that Winston loses so that we might win has become a popular interpretation among teachers and essayists. It frames the novel not as despair, but as a call to consciousness. Another continuing debate concerns Julia. Younger generations often read her differently than earlier critics did. To some, she is the true rebel, the one who understands instinctively that joy is a form of resistance. Others read her with frustration, arguing that Orwell did not give her enough psychological complexity. Modern feminist readings often emphasize the tension between Julia's bodily rebellion and Winston's intellectual one, asking what the novel suggests about gender roles and the politics of desire. The novel has also adapted surprisingly well to discussions about privacy and technology. Readers today see the telescreen as a metaphor for smartphones and the constant pings of surveillance capitalism. Some even argue that Orwell underestimated the sophistication of modern manipulation. Instead of fear and violence, today's control sometimes takes the form of convenience, distraction, and data harvesting. In this sense, the novel speaks to a new kind of unease, not about secret police booting down the door, but about invisible systems shaping our choices without us noticing. All these interpretations, from the earliest reviews to the latest online debates, show that 1984 has become more than literature. It has become a living conversation, a book that grows as the world changes, a story that readers keep adapting to their fears, their hopes, and their collective memory. And that is what gives the novel its enduring power. It belongs not just to Orwell, but to every generation that picks it up and sees a different warning reflected in its pages. When a novel refuses to stay in its century, when it keeps stepping quietly into the headlines decades after its author has died, it has crossed the boundary between literature and prophecy. That is what happened to 1984. It began as a warning from a man sitting on a remote island with tuberculosis, typing through pain and coughing fits, trying to finish one last book. But somewhere along the way, the novel slipped out of Orwell's hands and became something larger. It became a cultural alarm bell, the book people reach for whenever reality starts to wobble. One of the most surreal patterns of modern life is how 1984 climbs back up the bestseller charts every time a major political scandal erupts. A new surveillance revelation, a debate about misinformation, a public figure twisting the meaning of words until they lose their bones. And suddenly, people buy the book again, as if reopening an old notebook where someone had scribbled answers long before we knew the questions. What makes this especially powerful is that the novel does not match the world perfectly. Our world is not Oceania, but it is close enough in psychological shape that readers feel a little shiver when they notice the echoes. We do not live with telescreens bolted to our walls, but we do carry devices that listen, track, and influence our thoughts. We do not have the Ministry of Truth deleting newspaper archives in plain view. But we do have online spaces where fact, a rumor, and fiction blend together at frightening speed. We do not chant in 2-minute frenzies every morning, but we experience digital storms of collective anger every night. People today often read the novel through the lens of surveillance capitalism. Not the surveillance of jackboots and secret microphones, but the subtle, algorithmic surveillance that knows which videos we will watch and which ads we will click. This kind of surveillance feels almost gentle. It does not bark orders or demand loyalty. It simply nudges our attention in ways we barely notice. And yet when you think about it carefully, the psychological principle is the same. Someone else knows what you are doing. Someone else shapes what you see. Someone else benefits from predicting your behavior. The difference is that in Orwell's world, the surveillance feels violent. In ours, it often feels convenient. Readers point to the phrase, "Big Brother is watching you," and see a symbol for physical surveillance. But in modern discussions, the phrase has evolved. It now describes any system that observes us passively without asking permission. Some people use it to describe corporate data tracking. Others use it to describe new forms of political monitoring. It has become a shorthand for the feeling of being known a little too well by forces we cannot see. Another reason the novel remains in our headlines is its treatment of truth. In Orwell's universe, truth is not simply suppressed, it is replaced. The party does not hide information it dislikes, it rewrites it. It changes yesterday's facts to match today's political needs. And the disturbing thing is not that people believe the lies. The disturbing thing is that people eventually lose the ability to tell the difference between truth and propaganda. In our world, the mechanisms are different. We are not forced to memorize new slogans. Instead, we scroll through oceans of conflicting statements, half-truths, and carefully edited narratives. We often do not know what to trust, not because someone forbids us, but because there is too much information and too little clarity. Modern readers often note that misinformation today spreads not from a single central authority, but from millions of small, scattered sources, in a strange way that makes it more difficult to resist. When one institution controls truth, people can identify the enemy. When truth is fractured into 1,000 pieces, the enemy becomes confusion itself. In this sense, the modern world has created something Orwell did not fully imagine. Not a dictatorship of certainty, but a marketplace of chaos. And yet the emotional effect is similar. We feel disoriented. We feel overwhelmed. We feel that something important is always slipping through our fingers. The phrase doublethink has become a favorite among journalists and commentators, because we see forms of it everywhere. Political figures contradict themselves within days or even hours. Corporations advertise ethical values while engaging in unethical practices. Social media platforms claim to empower free speech while subtly restricting it. People say one thing publicly and another thing privately to avoid backlash. These contradictions are not always malicious, but they create a mental environment where logic becomes elastic. It becomes easier to accept what is convenient rather than what is consistent. Young readers in particular bring a fresh perspective to the novel. Many see it as a warning about emotional manipulation rather than political tyranny. They focus on how screens shape self-image, how online communities enforce conformity, and how people sometimes curate their identities for social approval. To them, the novel is not about state oppression alone. It is about the pressure to perform, to signal belonging, to align with digital tribes. They read Winston as someone desperately trying to hold on to a private self in a world that prizes spectacle over sincerity. And then there is the frightening relevance of Room 101, not as a torture chamber, but as a metaphor. For many modern readers, Room 101 represents our greatest personal fear, the fear of isolation, the fear of irrelevance, the fear of losing identity in the noise of the digital world. In this reading, the novel becomes a psychological map of how fear shapes behavior. Fear makes people betray their beliefs. Fear makes people betray each other. Fear makes people stay silent. What keeps 1984 in our headlines is not its prophetic accuracy, but its emotional precision. Orwell understood how fragile human beings become when they lose truth, privacy, and connection. He understood that oppression does not have to look theatrical. It can look ordinary. It can feel almost natural. It can arrive in the tone of a friendly suggestion rather than a shouted command. And perhaps the most haunting thing is this: every time the world changes, the novel changes with it. New readers discover new warnings. New debates arise. New symbols become relevant. The book keeps speaking because we keep creating conditions that make its voice necessary. It is not a map of one possible future. It is a mirror that shows us the instinct in human societies to drift toward control when fear and uncertainty rise. That is why the novel keeps coming back into the public conversation. Because every time we feel like the ground beneath our feet is shifting, we look for a story that can explain the shape of our unease. Orwell's voice answers, soft but steady, from 70 years ago. He tells us that danger rarely begins with violence. It begins with language, with memory, with fear, with the tiny surrender of letting someone else define what is real.